All right, welcome to part two of our Introduction to Culture lecture. And in this part of the lecture, what we're going to talk about is how are local culture sustained given the onslaught of popular culture. The slides were designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture, and I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So, basically what we're going to do when we do this lecture is we're going to talk a little bit about how not just popular culture really, but dominant cultures have attempted to kind of take over localized cultures. We'll talk a little bit about how local cultures have pushed back, and we'll give some examples and things. And we'll talk a little bit more, and we'll end on a similar note to what we start with, and we'll talk kind of about what's going on more today. So, first thing we want to talk about is this idea of assimilation. And assimilation on a basic level just means that a person or group of people lose their cultural traits, that they choose to give them up. Okay, so that's on a basic level. But really it falls into two categories. You can do that voluntarily, right? You can move to a place and then decide that you identify with your new home so much so that you stop speaking your previous language and you stop eating your previous food and wearing your previous clothes and behaving in ways that were appropriate where you were from, right? That's voluntary assimilation. But in a lot of cases, especially historically, and especially when we're talking about colonialism, what we're really talking about is involuntary or forced assimilation. And this happens all over the world, not just in the US, but we're going to talk a lot more about the US than we are about the rest of the world. So, the big example that we talk about in your book, and one of the big ones that you need to know just in general, is the general policy of the US government, especially in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, was to assimilate indigenous peoples into dominant culture, read white American culture, in order to make the Indians into Americans as opposed to Indians. And here in the US, and they did similar things in Canada and Australia as well, we did this in a few ways. One is through the reservation system. So we would confine people onto a system, not really, confine might be a bit strong of a word. We would encourage them to live in a certain place, and then we would bring in other folks to help educate them and teach them how to farm and keep house and in general just behave like the dominant culture. But the other, arguably more insidious and in the long term much more harmful method of doing this was the boarding school route. And essentially what happened with the boarding school thing is that kids get taken from their parents, often forcibly, at very young ages and taken away, sometimes on the reservation, normally off the reservation, to boarding schools where they were isolated from their families and to a large degree from their communities, and then they were penalized, they were punished for acting in traditional ways. So for speaking their indigenous language or for engaging in behaviors that were appropriate in Native American communities but were considered backwards or wrong when we look at white communities. Okay, so that's forced assimilation. A lot of problems we see in Native American communities today, incidentally, can be traced back to this forced assimilation. And the whole idea behind this was that we wanted to, the slogan that goes along with it, and it sounds really horrible, is kill the Indian to save the man. So we want to get rid of that Indian culture as a way of incorporating them into the dominant culture and ultimately turning them again into Americans. And this happens Australia, it happens in Canada, right? These boarding schools and similar kinds of things. It talks about Russia a little bit in your textbook. You should know Russia's slightly different situation because it's not about so much about taking people away as it is encouraging, for example, in particular, we see it under the USSR, where groups of Russians were encouraged to move into territories that used to belong to the USSR republics, was what they called them. And so they would move into these places and all the government stuff would be done in Russian, the schools would be taught in Russian, so people would be required to learn Russian. They weren't necessarily, for the most part, penalized for speaking their own language when they weren't at school or weren't at government offices and things, but it was strongly discouraged. So much so that in some areas they kind of start to lose it. And this is why if you ever look at a map of Eastern Europe, if you look at a linguistic map or a cultural map, what you'll see are these pockets of Russian speakers in places like the Western Ukraine. Okay, or I think it's Western Ukraine, I think it is. But anyways, is because these ethnic Russians were encouraged to move into that area as a way of Russifying um, Soviet republics. Okay, but back on topic. When we're talking about American Indians, in particular in the U.S., they've been really, especially lately, working to push back against assimilation and push back against some of the more negative influences of popular culture in terms of losing culture by seeking to try and revive customs that they have held, as they would say, from time immemorial. So, and again, those customs are like local cultures tend to be sustained through these, but they're specific practices that groups of people routinely follow. With that, right, so once we've got those practices, and they could be things like a certain way of fishing, or that we prepare our food in a certain way, or we do a certain type of exercise, or we worship in a certain way, okay? Or gender roles are a certain way. What local cultures try to do in general, especially when we're talking about those folk cultures, is they work very hard to avoid cultural appropriation, which is that process by which other cultures, typically cultures with more power, try to adopt customs or knowledge and use them for their own benefit. And the great example we were talking about of this in class was, for example, yoga from India. Yoga is actually a very traditional Hindi practice, but when you see it here in the United States, it's ripped from that broader context. And in so doing, most yoga studios in the US, for example, do not focus on the more spiritual aspects of it, and certainly they don't teach you the religious piece of it, right? But India, for example, has a whole ministry dedicated just to yoga as a way of making sure that they're kind of trying to maintain the image and things like that, and keep it closer to what it originally was. So local cultures, they really try to keep that popular culture out, because remember, as we were talking about in the last lecture, popular culture makes everything alike. Local cultures, they want to be unique. They want to be different. They want to have that tie to their history and to their past. And so they seek very hard to try and maintain control over those customs and that knowledge. In rural areas, local cultures often have an easier time of maintaining their culture just because of the isolation, right? But even with that, when local cultures stop doing their major economic activity, and in this case what we're talking about is the ways in which people support their families, right? They really face challenges. And we see this a lot with Native American cultures, where if they were forced to stop engaging a certain type of, say, hunting or fishing activity, then all the customs that relate to that, all the knowledge that relates to that, tends to kind of wither and die. And with it, those ties to history that form such a huge part of people's identity. And so sustaining the culture becomes very, very difficult. When local cultures decide to try and re-engage, by the way, with those traditional economic activities or other cultural customs, they don't decide that in isolation. So it becomes very impacted by what else is going on around them and in the world. Take, for example, the Macaw Indians, which are a Native American tribe here in Washington State. So historically, the Macaw hunted whales for about 1,500 years. The U.S. government has them stop in the 1920s when the gray whale becomes endangered. They stop for roughly 75 years. Then the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration takes the North Pacific gray whale off its endangered species list. The Macaw promptly file to be able to hunt whales. They get a permit to hunt, I think it's like 5 whales a year, and they typically do no more than 1 or 2 in any given year. But the decision to do that, first of all, they have to file permit paperwork to be able to hunt whales. Then they had to give up traditional ways of doing that because of concerns regarding cruelty to animals and the like. So they had to modify and adjust what they did. They used to, I think they were spear hunters. Now they shoot rifles, right? But it's not just them out on the water. Every time the Macaw go out to go hunt a whale, which again they don't do super often, no more than once or twice a year, it's also them and their new best friends, the Greenpeace protesters, who are protesting their hunting whales, or if not Greenpeace, then some other organization with a similar sort of goal. Okay, another example that we could look at, and we didn't talk about this one in class, are residents in the town of Lindsborg, Kansas, which proclaim their town Little Sweden, USA. So as a way of linking back to that Swedish heritage, during the 1950s, they decided to highlight the everyday existence of the Swedes who had immigrated to Lindsborg, and so they've kind of built their town around this, right? Lots of places do this as a way of, partially in terms of building tourism and the like, but also of maintaining those historical ties. So the geographer James Shortridge refers to this as neo-localism, and neo again means new. So they're seeking out kind of the regional culture, or the local culture, and they're reinvigorating it as a way of responding to the uncertainty and the rapid change of the modern world. Pardon me. Sorry, my throat's a little dry. We talk about urban areas, so we've been talking about kind of more rural areas. Talk about urban areas. Great example of local culture is ethnic neighborhoods. And so they try to maintain their own identity, obviously, through some of the basics, like things like signage, or to get declared as historical, or things like that. But you could also even extend that urban local culture to specific parts of a city. So for example, in Seattle, there's the University District, which feels very different than downtown when you go there, or very different than some of the other neighborhoods, right? Say Georgetown in Seattle feels very different than other areas. So local culture can be very, very narrow. It can go down even to parts of cities. So when we talk about local culture, remember I said we were going to talk about some of how pop cultures continue to impede, that's where we'd end, and this is indeed our last slide. Right. What we see is this fight between local and popular culture, and local culture tries to maintain its unique identity, and with that, sometimes what will end up happening is the commercialization or the commodification of local culture in a way that raises questions of authenticity. And commodification is really just a fancy schmancy way of saying that we turn things that previously weren't bought and sold into things that can be bought, sold, or traded. So yoga would be an example of this, right? Because most people actually pay for their yoga lessons, whereas historically in India, generally speaking, you did not. Okay, you could see this with Native American dream catchers as another great example of commodification of culture. And when that happens, what it kind of does is it freezes culture in time. And culture itself is very dynamic, and culture is constantly changing and adjusting and adapting and growing. But when we commodify it, what we do is we kind of freeze it in time. And when you do that freezing in time, then what happens is these people who come in and are buying that commodified culture, if they see something very different going on with the people who actually daily live and breathe that culture, raises that question of which is authentic. Right? Which is authentic? The actual people actually doing something different than what you expect, or the culture that you can buy and sell? And with that, you get arguments then, which can lead to problems with cultures being sustained, with cultures really having to struggle in terms of what their identity is and what it means. So I've thrown a lot of information at you today, so if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please by all means feel free to come see me, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.